2-2.1.2 The weak points of the state. A child can crush the spider with his hand, yet no king can possess a throne room that she cannot invade. An emperor can command 1,000,000 slaves, yet when he sleeps she may walk across his brow. A president may order the destruction of cities, but he is not immune to her venom. In the dark corner, when the moment is right, her egg sacs open, and thousands of her children invade the palace. And there are more of us every day. The Federal Reserve in the United States and its IMF cohorts around the world provide the lion's share of the funding that our enemy, the state, uses to continue its dominance of humanity. The blockchain and her children, cryptocurrencies, are like millions of spiders spinning webs and moving about as they see fit, doing what they want, where they want, in spite of every effort to stop them. Some find the blockchain terrifying, some find her complicated, and some fail to notice her at all. She is a beautiful marvel if you see her with the right eyes. However, on her own, she is not enough to kill the beast. We must look further. Physical components of the state, governments, central banks, crony corporations, the military-industrial complex, the mainstream media, and the mainstream entertainment industry, all possess the same weakness in their structure. They are all based on collectivism, central planning, and constant internal power struggles to maintain order. The phrase "dog eat dog" was coined to describe their inner workings. The image of the snake swallowing its tail epitomizes the turmoil that is indicative of the components of the state. They are a serpent constantly devouring itself, a fake perpetual motion machine that always consumes its internal parts to maintain the illusion of functionality. On the physical, economic level, the only thing that keeps this beast alive is the continuous stream of flesh, blood, and sweat harvested from the productive of the world and fed into the flames of its belly. And that inner turmoil is the weak point in the armor of the state where we must drive our lance. When you understand this weak point, you will see that it exists in every aspect of the physical components of the state. 2-2.1.2.01 Using the corporation as an example. Many large corporations are incredibly delicate. Assuming the corporation is doing well, making money, and stable in its sector, there is a good likelihood it depends on government contracts, a government-provided quasi-monopoly, corporate welfare, or some other kind of government-provided advantage. In other words, the corporation depends on the political model of taxation and theft and cronyism to survive. No matter its appearance of stability, if you look closely, you will see that the actual workforce has little to no motivation to work hard, strive to improve, seek innovation, nor function efficiently. The best workers are the few who show up to work every day, don't talk back to managers, and don't steal. The go-getter, the overproducer, is seen as a threat to his fellow worker and sometimes even a threat to his slackered boss. The corporate boss, on every level, has a built-in motivation to keep the productive workers down the ladder in production positions while advancing the less productive up the corporate ladder. This is a well-documented phenomenon called the Peter Principle. Consider the following example. Supervisor Bob has 10 workers. He is one of 5 peer-level supervisors, each of which has 10 workers. So 50 workers, 5 supervisors. Bob and his 4 supervisor peers answer to a manager named Tom, and Tom is one of 5 managers. Tom informs Bob and his peers that a manager spot has opened, and one of Bob's peers, Joe, has been chosen to move up. Bob is being considered as the next in line to move up to manager. Tom tells Bob that Bob may choose one of the 50 workers to be the new supervisor replacing Joe. Does Bob select the top worker, knowing this new supervisor will compete with Bob for the next manager spot? Or does Bob pick one of the workers who is barely competent so that the new supervisor will not outperform Bob and not be chosen to pass Bob, becoming the new manager? Of course, the answer is that Bob will likely choose someone who will not be a threat to Bob's advancement. Bob will not choose the best worker. Bob may even select the worst worker to replace Joe. Interruption. At this point in the example, the question becomes, why did Tom choose Joe to move up to manager? Did Tom pick the best supervisor, or did Tom pick the one he knew was barely competent so that Tom wouldn't be threatened in his next advancement? This is critical in understanding corporate structure. If you are confused or didn't follow this demonstration, please read it again or look up the Peter Principle and acquaint yourself with this phenomenon because it is important to knowing our enemy. Now multiply this formula over every level of the corporate structure from the janitorial staff to the board of directors. Add into the equation internal politics, jealousy, personal animosity, nepotism, and personal relationships. The final result is a business model that can only compete with other inept crony corporations. In an actual free market, unencumbered by government favoritism and advantages, such a business would quickly crumble. Once again, the above described business structure is the pattern that the physical components of the state are all designed to function under. So the underpinnings of the state, the feet of the idol as it were, are made of clay. Simple slacktivism in and of itself can be a tremendous threat to the stability of the beast. The great redemption in this revelation is that the truth of the above described weakness of the state is already well known to vast numbers of state supporters. All we need to do is shine the light of mass system failure onto this flaw while providing a logical solution. 2-2.1.2.02 The corporation stifles innovation and progress. The following story is one example of the incompetence of the state and the vulnerability that it displays. However, this is just one example. With little thought and effort, these flaws can be revealed in every product and service that the state, through its governments and crony corporatism, monopolistically force upon us. In the 1960s and 70s, many respected construction engineers began speaking out against the use of overhead electrical transmission lines as opposed to underground lines. Although the topic remains debatable today, the advantage of underground lines are significant. They are demonstrably more reliable and safer, yet the utility companies were resistant to widely adopt the new method. Their primary reasons: their existing infrastructure was committed to the overhead model, and installation of underground lines cost 5 to 15 times more than overhead. Those arguing in favor of underground pointed out that construction companies could be charged the price difference and simply pass the cost to the consumers through higher construction prices. These would be disproportionately covered by business rather than individual homeowners. However, the utility industry resisted and lobbied to stop local, state, and federal regulations requiring underground lines. In the background, and less obvious to the casual observer, was the fact that the powerful timber and coal interests were raking in a fortune selling creosote-injected wooden poles to the utility giants, and they were also lobbying against the underground utilities at the same time. Because of antiquated subsidies and regulations regarding the expansion of the electrical grid dating back to the 1930s, the utility companies had a tax-sponsored incentive to resist the underground method in favor of the overhead. So, as the utility giants expanded their electrical grid through the 1980s and 1990s, they stayed with the technology of the 1880s, funded by laws of the 1930s, rather than adapting and modernizing to the current state of the industry. Remember the preceding paragraph the next time an ice storm or a hurricane leaves 500,000 Americans without power for a couple weeks. Now think about what would happen if a small, dedicated group of fanatics decided to drive around the countryside with a rifle taking out remote transformers. Such a situation would be uncomfortable in the Southwest during the summer, but could be considered mass murder if it happened around the Great Lakes in February. And yet, isn't that what the state has done by incentivizing the overhead lines throughout regions that regularly suffer crushing ice storms? Some may ask, if the market is so great, why can't it provide a better solution than 1880s-style overhead wires or expensive trenching and underground lines? Late 1990s fuel cell technology using existing natural gas infrastructure demonstrated private ownership of generators could provide cheap, clean, quiet, reliable electricity to new home construction in North America, adding roughly $10,000 to the sale price of each new home, but recovering that amount in utility cost savings while virtually eliminating power outages. At the same time, several small startup companies were competing to get these generators on the market. Please note here, these were not magic-free energy machines. Fuel cells are established, reliable electric generators. Once sales of the fuel cells caught on in the construction market, projections indicated the cost of a home fuel cell generator may have fallen by 50% by 2002, making them widely available and affordable as a retrofit in the booming home renovation sector. Big energy companies saw the profit potential and began absorbing the small startup companies, but the potential for the consumer still seemed limitless. However, energy giants Enron, GE, Berkshire Hathaway, Boone Pickens Capital Management, and others clashed in 2000-2001, resulting in the fall of Enron, the evaporation of incredible amounts of false capital, and the hope of energy-independent housing practically vanished, while continued mass dependency on the 1880s-style power grid was almost guaranteed for another generation due to the same factors involved in resisting the innovation of underground utilities 2 decades earlier. This example of corporate mishandling of technology could easily be seen as evidence of some grand conspiracy to control the energy market. However, no conspiracy is needed to explain this tragedy. This is simply the way giant corporations and the existing capital management systems work. In theory, government regulators should prevent events like this from happening. However, the opposite is true. The history of modern banking/corporate regulatory practices shows conclusively that this is exactly how the system is designed to function. This example provides an insight into 2 distinct and separate weaknesses of the state. The first weakness can be exploited through education and propaganda. Unfortunately, the Enron scandal is complicated, and as you attempt to explain it to the average state believer, his eyes will likely glaze over in boredom and disinterest long before your point can be made. If you're knowledgeable of the intricate details of this massive scandal, and if you have the skill set to tell this tale without your listeners dropping into a comatose state, you may be able to convince your listener that the whole corporate/government system is designed to inhibit innovation while draining the maximum amount of wealth from the productive sector and funneling that wealth into the banking/investment sector. Good luck with that, since the Enron scandal has been told over and over, with almost no one even mentioning the fuel cell aspect of the story. It may be easier to expose the flaw in being dependent upon the banking/corporation/government structure that provides the energy to your home that keeps your children alive during the winter. The promise from the state is that the state provides for us what the market by itself cannot. Not only is that a lie, the state actually provides a very unstable supply of overpriced energy. The energy grid is incredibly delicate due to the fact that it is the product of 135 years of central planning. It is rife with flaws, weak design, overburdened bottlenecks, and inefficiency. The power companies are riddled with corruption and stagnant thinking and shackled by regulations that stopped making any sense 75 years ago, if they ever made sense at all. So we have this propaganda/education opportunity, but only if it is explained correctly or demonstrated in practical terms. But who will listen, and why will they listen so long as the lights work? Thus we have the second weakness provided by this example. The state's power grid, while keeping the people of North America alive every winter, is incredibly delicate, and yet it is a source of faith in the existing system. Consider this. The Nile River was the source of life for old Egypt. If the Nile rises every time Pharaoh sacrifices to the gods, then every time the Nile rises, it proves the divinity of Pharaoh. However, if Pharaoh makes the sacrifice but the Nile fails, faith in Pharaoh weakens. If Pharaoh promises to solve the Nile problem, but the Nile fails again, even after painful sacrifice by the people, more will question their faith in Pharaoh. Pharaoh's reaction will almost certainly be to double down on the sacrifice at the cost of the people. The lesson here is that so long as the evidence seems to support the state's narrative, the believers have no reason to question their faith. But when the system fails and fails again in spite of the state's efforts and promises, faith can be shaken. This is the single largest flaw in the armor of the state. It can't provide what it promises. We have electricity during the winter in spite of the state, not because of it. Again, the examples stated here are indicative of every product and service the state claims monopolistic right to supply. In every case, the state is vulnerable to a 3-pronged attack if that attack is done correctly. Prong 1 involves the careful infiltration of the manpower of the target. In other words, anarchists employed at the points of weakness. Friend saboteurs should develop a functional understanding of the infrastructure of the target. Controlled probing and testing provide information on target reactions and responses. Weaknesses are discovered and prioritized. Simple acts of sabotage harass the target while setting up a larger attack. During this time, the second prong of the attack begins to come into play, that being education and propaganda. Above-ground activists preach against the centrally planned state behemoth, warning that such structures are unstable and that society should not rely on something as undependable as the state. As the above-ground activists loudly predict disaster, the underground saboteurs provide the disaster. When the Nile fails and fails again, the pharaoh reacts with violence, increased confiscations, and oppression, thus faith in the state weakens. And then, eventually the people begin to understand that there is no connection between the Nile and the state. The pharaoh and all his ministers are nothing but a violent gang of thieves. People stop making excuses for them, and they stop protecting them. At this point, the third prong strikes with precision and removes the human leadership of the state, thus ends the war. It should be noted that the timing of the third prong is critical. If you strike too soon or are too obvious, you garner sympathy for the state actors. If you strike too late, you may miss the critical moment of vulnerability, and you may have to repeat the first two operations. It should also be noted that there can be no public connection between the friend saboteurs and the above-ground activists. The above-ground activists must consistently denounce sabotage or dismiss accusations of sabotage as crazy conspiracy theories concocted by desperate state actors to hide their incompetence. Do not miss this important point. When state actors blame anarchists for well-executed sabotage, above-ground activists can claim the status are crazy conspiracy theorists. Finally, the third prong in this example should be recognized as the selective irregular warfare mentioned earlier. There should never be a public connection between selective irregular warfare and the above-ground activists, nor the network of friend saboteurs. These must appear to be separate, unrelated entities. In best practice, there should never be an acknowledgement of the existence of the friend saboteurs, nor of the existence of the irregular warriors. Largely, their success depends on their invisibility. When done in one sector of industry or one sector of the economy or one geographical location, the above procedure can be damaging to the state. When coordinated to strike many sectors at once, the truth of the state will be revealed for all to see. If done correctly, coordinated on a worldwide scale, this procedure will only need to be done once. The state is like a great colossus on a pedestal, made of steel and crowned in gold, but standing on feet of clay. It's not the job of the friend saboteur to melt the steel. After all, Molotov cocktails won't melt steel beams. It is only our job to make fissures in the clay. Gravity will do the rest.